Hello, Lucky Paper Radio listeners. This is Andy, and you guessed it. If you listened to last week's intro and heard that my wife got COVID, I, in fact, also got COVID, as is to be expected. So we could not go on our vacation as planned, but because I was sick, I still couldn't record with Anthony in person, so we are still coming at you with this special bonus episode, which is friends of the show, Parker LaMascus and Jason Waddell, talking about a game that they love that is not Magic, Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire is a cool single-player strategy card game where you basically play through these series of randomized battles and build and improve your deck as you fight through. And I think that Jason and Parker have some really interesting insights on it that will be especially relevant to you if you also enjoy Slay the Spire. But even if you don't, is still some evergreen game design conversation for you. I feel so lucky and grateful to have amazing friends like Parker and Jason to make a great episode like this for us while we take a week off. So a huge thank you to them. Thank you, Parker and Jason. Jason has been streaming Slay the Spire on his Twitch channel at twitch.tv/RiptideLab. I'll put that in the show notes. And we'll be back to you next week with a regular episode of Lucky Paper Radio.
Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your temporary host, Parker LaMascus, here with the owner of Riptide Lab Cube Forum, the inventor of Grid Draft, Jason Waddell.
Hello, good to be back. It's my second appearance on Lucky Paper Radio. I've now been on with 3 of the 4 members of Lucky Paper, so waiting on that to join in. How do you pronounce that?
You know, I think Jet would appreciate it, like if we tried to mangle it as much as possible. So,
sure,
creative interpretations are welcome. Okay, so the reason Andy and Anthony aren't with us today is that we're going to be discussing Slay the Spire, which is a game that they have not played. Magic is such a complex game with this like interlocking ecosystem of different structures that's just hard to talk about in the abstract. It's so complex that sometimes the best way to understand Magic is through talking about a different game. And that's what we'll be doing today. So Jason and I have both been playing a lot of Slay the Spire. And Jason, why don't you define or describe Slay the Spire to somebody who's never heard of it, but maybe has played Magic and has that background?
I'm going to start with a different game as a reference, actually. So Slay the Spire is kind of built on the phenomenon known as Dominion, which is a card game that came out, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago now, and kind of forced a million spin-offs. So Dominion is a deck building game where you start off with a very small deck, like a 10-card deck. In each turn, you draw a fresh 5-card hand. You're limited in terms of how many action cards you can play. You can only play 1 action card per turn. Of course, there are action cards that generate more actions for you to use, so you can chain these together in certain ways. And then after you've played out your hand, at the end of your turn, you discard your whole hand. And the way that the game works is that you buy cards from kind of a communal pool, and you want to be the first one out of everyone you're playing against to accumulate the most victory points. And Dominion kind of was known with the reputation of being called a multiplayer solitaire game, where theoretically there were like a little bit of interaction pieces you could do. But mostly it was about who could build the most efficient engine relative to their opponents. And they're all kind of using the same resources with some RNG. And Slay the Spire takes that concept and turns it into a kind of like a dungeon crawling deck builder. It's a single player game, so we don't have to worry about it being multiplayer solitaire. It is just straight solitaire. You get a 5-card hand every turn, and you have 3 energy, 3 mana, however you want to put it, to spend on cards. All the cards in this game have a energy cost, and you are fighting against increasingly difficult monsters. And the idea is that the enemies you take on are growing in power exponentially, and you need to make a deck that grows in power exponentially as well to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah. And it's also what's known as, I think, a roguelike game, in that, like, if you fail a battle and your health gets dropped to 0, it's game over. There's no extra lives. There's no checkpoints, so you can't reload the save. It's just over, and you have to start a new run with a quasi-randomly generated dungeon and quasi-random rewards as well. So that's part of the appeal for me, is that it's really difficult, and every time you play, like, it's never the same game twice. It's never the same deck twice.
Yeah, so the game has 4 different characters, and like you say, it's a roguelike, so most roguelikes are built with kind of this philosophy that they're meant to be very challenging, very skill rewarding, but also very replayable. And so one of the interesting things about Slay the Spire is that there are 4 different characters you can choose from, and each one, if you will, is kind of its own isolated environment. For the most part, one character's cards are not accessible to any of the other characters, so each
almost like a color of magic or something.
Yeah, and each character's kind of designed as its own cube, if you will, and that there's multiple, like, different things each character can do, archetypes, if you will. But I think that's maybe like a bit of a narrow way to think about it. And the game is designed in such a way that there's really interesting overlaps and intersections, and also kind of like anti-synergies at times between the different cards in the card pool. And each character's card pool is only like 70 cards, and like 20 of those are rare. So it's more or less like 50 cards that you're using over and over, which is not a huge card pool. What they do is kind of make sure that it's the right cards. Like, each card in the design is very purposeful and like what it's doing for the character, how it relates to the different strategies it can do. And the game really gets a lot of mileage out of having the right cards over having just a bunch of different cards for the sake of variety.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So you take damage. At the start of every turn, you see how much damage an enemy intends to inflict upon you. And you'll have, in a typical hand, a number of attack cards, a number of block cards. And damage that you take is permanent. So, like, if you start a battle at 50 health and you take 10 damage, you'll start the next battle at 40 health. So there's kind of this tension between how much do I want to block versus attack. And when you first start playing the game, maybe you simplify it in your mind to, I want to block as much, all the damage I can that's incoming, and then, attack with the rest of my mana that I have. But very quickly they teach you that there are enemies that scale over the course of a battle. So one of the first enemies you face will deal 6 damage the first turn, and then 11 the next, and then 16 the next. So you can't really take full damage mitigation as a strategy turn by turn. You have to kind of like weigh those things.
So I guess one additional point of like clarification would be that for the most part, your cards interact with a couple of resources in the game. They sometimes attack your enemies, and that's how you defeat them and progress in the dungeon. Or conversely, they create block, which protects your own health from your enemy's attacks. Or I guess the third major resource that it interacts with is it draws or scries or discards cards. So in the same way that we think about card advantage in Magic, I think an analogous concept exists in Slay the Spire.
Now you sent me a document before this podcast on your thoughts of this game, which you've played a lot, but also not a lot. How much have you played this game?
suffice it to say, I'm much worse than Jason. I have 40 hours logged in this game, and I've beaten it a couple times on the easy difficulty levels, but I think Jason is much more of an expert here than I am.
Yeah, I've played it on a couple different... I've played it on Xbox and on Steam. I don't know what the total hour count is, but I've beaten it on the hardest difficulty with every character. So
okay, yeah,
yeah,
okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm very much like at the beginning of my journey as a Slay the Spire spike, whereas you, Jason, are like way up there in the spikeness of this game.
Yeah, it goes pretty deep. Some people are extremely talented at this game. I've noticed that for the most part of like cubers that I've talked to, people have not been that good at Spire. And I remember someone in the Riptide community saying that they never beat the heart because they build their decks too fair, which I think is an absurd concept in a single player environment.
Yeah, because like, why not combo off, or why not build a storm deck if you can?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I've been a huge proponent within Cube of like promoting very fair, interactive environments, and you know, my Cube was certainly not the first, but one of the earliest to really like cut out a ton of kind of these like unfair, feel bad cards without there being like a strict like. I'm not calling my cube like low power or peasant, uncommon, any of that. I just want the cards that are like fun to play with and against. And in Spire and another roguelike deck builders, it's the total opposite. I try to storm off as much as possible, as frequently as possible, even when it's not really the ideal approach to whatever run I'm in. So sometimes that's to my detriment. But I think a lot of what you know from Magic, you kind of have to recontextualize Inspire.
Right.
And I'll give you... So in the document, can you recall you listed 3 basic resources in the game?
Yeah. So I think the 3 basic resources are cards, health, and mana. And you have to manage those in order to beat an enemy and progress in the game.
This is a good starting point. I would add a couple to this list. The first being floors. If you want to beat the heart, which is on floor 55, you have 55 floors to get as strong as possible. So the floors are your resources for increasing the strength of your deck. And there was a discussion in the Riptide. We have a Slay the Spire Discord channel, or like sub-channel. And somebody posted a screenshot of, there's a fight in the game where you encounter these thieves, and there's always 2 options. You can either pay them all of your money to skip the fight, or you can fight them. And if you fight them, you are guaranteed a relic, which is called a red mask. It makes your enemies weak on turn 1 of every fight. You get gold from the fight. You get a card reward screen, which they show you 3 cards. You can select one of them to go into your deck or skip. This person at the time where they screenshotted it had 1 gold, which is a very low amount to have. And so they had the option, pay 1 gold to skip this fight. And they posted in the thread in the Discord, 1 gold to skip a fight. That's a deal that's too good to pass up. But it's 1 gold to skip a floor. It's one of your, it's like 2% of your run, like one of the 50 floors that you are skipping And it's one of the most rewarding floors that you get a relic for a relatively easy fight.
Yeah.
And so I think if you contextualize like a floor as a resource, it changes how you think about the game in a way that might be very unfamiliar to Magic players.
Yeah, I don't know that it's like, well, okay, I'll admit it's certainly new to me, and it'll probably level up my Slay the Spire game. But I do think Magic players have something that's similar in the concept of draft picks. Like you have 45 decisions during a draft, usually, that will lead you down a path to the best deck. And I think Magic players are often reluctant to make short-term sacrifices in their draft pick to open up a path to a better deck overall. So like picking a piece of fixing early will open up multiple decks, but some people might be reluctant to pick a land early.
The difference being that you cannot die during the draft. Right. The other resource I would list, and this is a big issue in another roguelike deck builder that I've been doing some design and development on, is time, like your human time. Like it's a single player game. In theory, you could spend, I don't know, like 100 hours, 1,000 hours on a single run. You could simulate draw probabilities or all sorts of things that will give you a slight edge in your run. And do you know how long your average like winning run is?
I don't tend to time myself. I just start a run and then lose myself.
I've gotten it down to about an hour. When I started, my winning runs were like 2.5 to 3 hours. Another thing you put in this document is that the resource system is very different from Magic. In Magic, you have the standard draw one card a turn, play one land a turn, and that's like your primary constraint.
Yeah. So in Spire, by contrast to Magic, you are granted 5 cards a turn, and you are granted 3 mana a turn. Like no matter what you do, and sometimes you can increase your mana intake or your cards and get even more every turn. So in that sense, cards like are much less. The value of the text "draw a card" is much less powerful in Slay the Spire versus Magic. So you can often find these like 0 mana cantrips in Slay the Spire. And in Magic, that would be broken because you can only draw 1 card a turn and it'll double the amount of cards you see. In Slay the Spire, it's adding 1 to the 5 you've already seen. So that text is much less relevant. On the other hand, something like Gaining Life, which tends to kind of suck in Magic, generally speaking, is not so bad in Slay the Spire because you have to manage your health over 55 floors. So the way that the starting resources are allocated, or the way that the loop of the game proceeds, is what determines which cards are powerful and why.
Yeah. So there's a card in Spire which is literally Ancestral Recall. It's 1 energy to draw 3 cards, and it's not bad, but it's not like the power 9 of the game by any means. I think in these deck building games, the main thing that designers of them have to be aware of is the ease of going infinite. And so you talked about the resources of the mana that you have and the card draw that you have. And a lot of this, the beauty of Slay the Spire is that your character gets stronger through like layered synergies and interactions. So you'll have some basic effect that, I don't know, on floor 5, and I'll get into a concrete example of this in a minute, does something kind of like minimal, and then by floor 50, the interactions it has with the other things in your deck kind of blossom into something exponentially powerful.
Yeah.
The risk you have with the card pool a little bit is that if you make card draw and energy generation very strong, I don't know, like if you have a bunch of like draw 5s and gain 3 energy, is that you can just fill your deck with those and then go infinite.
Right.
So I feel like Spire has like pretty like reined in those things. You can go infinite, but it's like something you have to work towards. But the main designing principle behind Spire is that you get stronger through synergy. Synergy with your cards and synergy with your relics. And we talked a bit before we started recording. I wanted to bring up a card, Reckless Charge. This is a 0 mana attack. It deals 7 damage, and when you play it, you shuffle a Dazed into your draw pile. A Dazed is a status card, basically a dead card that, in Magic terms, exiles itself at the end of your turn when you have it in your hand.
Yeah, it'd be almost like a Darksteel Relic or something, except no type line, doesn't synergize with anything necessarily.
Have you played with this card?
I have not. I've tended to stay away from it, and maybe that's just because I'm a little more of a novice here, but like I am hesitant to essentially clutter up my deck with a bunch of Darksteel Relics. I've seen successful builds of Ironclad that are highly, like in Magic terms, they would be a very black mage kind of thing. You're dealing damage to yourself. You're drawing lots of cards because you're using your life as a resource. You get strength buffs. The weaker in health you get, kind of like Death Shadow or something. So I think that's an archetype that I've played with the Ironclad. I've also seen a successful blocking-based build, which would be based around taking a minimum amount of damage and then converting that into a big burst of attack damage. But I have to admit, this is my least favorite character of the 4, so I don't have much personal experience with it.
Okay. I'm realizing as I'm talking to you that it's possible you haven't unlocked all of the Ironclad cards yet.
Yeah, maybe. I think I've gotten most of them.
All right. So when I look at this card, so it's a 0 cost card. Most of your cards tend to cost 1 in this game. Ironclad does have a lot of 2 cost cards, but if you have like a 5-card hand, generally you can play like 3 of them and then 2 of them you can't play. This being 0 cost means that it's like an extra card that you can play that turn. So that's like the very level 0 in that like it's going to be a kind of like marginal increase to your damage output. Obviously, this has a big relation to how much card draw you have in your deck. So the more card draw your deck has, the better 0 cost things get, because you're going to get more cards, but you don't have more energy. So free cards are great in those regards. And also, if you have a lot of card draw, getting that dead card later is less of a drawback. Another thing you mentioned was the strength scaling. So all the characters in Spire can gain strength. If you have, say, a card that does 10 damage for 1 energy at your base strength, if you have 20 strength, that'll do 30 damage. So 10 plus your strength.
Yeah.
There are cards that can make Ironclad have a lot of strength. And let's imagine for a second that you have like 50 strength. At that point, your 1 cost card, let's say it does 12, is going to do 62, and the 0 cost 7 damage thing now does 57. So if you compare like 0 mana for 57 damage versus 1 mana for 62 damage. Those are, when you get to that high amount of strength, the efficiency of being 0 mana matters a lot more.
Right. Yeah.
Now, these are all like kind of the basic things. This card actually interacts with pretty much every power that Ironclad has. Powers which we haven't really covered are usually like when this, do that type of statements. So like when you exhaust or exile a card, you draw a card, that sort of thing.
Yeah. When you lose HP, you gain a mana. Or like when you damage yourself, you gain a mana or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there is a power called Evolve, which says whenever you draw a status card, which is like one of these dead cards, you draw a card or 2 cards if Evolve is upgraded. There is a card that says when you exhaust a card, you draw a card.
Right.
There is one that says when you exhaust the card, you gain block. And from those powers there, you can already see that you could use this to slot into that big block deck that you're trying to do. You can use it with 2 different powers to generate card draw. And so like you start off with this 0 cost card that like marginally increases your output and has the drawback of this dazed, but it might be that based on how you've built your deck, that this dazed, when you get it later, will draw you 4 cards. It'll like give you 12 block when it exhausts. It'll do all these other things for you. And so that's kind of like the multiplicative layered interaction type of thing. And I think it's like, it's a very simple card whose, not every deck wants it. It's not like objectively amazing. But in the right set of synergies, it'll be like a huge workhorse in your deck. And I was watching a run from a streamer recently who they were playing against Slime Boss in Act 1, and Slime Boss on one of the earlier turns he puts 5 slimes into your deck, which are also Darksteel Relic kind of cards.
Yeah.
And so he took Fire Breathing, which is a power that deals AoE damage every time you draw a status card, just as like a way to get through that fight. And so it's kind of interesting to me that like the game itself gives you mechanical hooks not only through your own cards, but through like what your enemies are going to be doing. And I find that a lot of the like very basic cards in the game have these hooks to like draw you into different kind of synergy clusters. And it almost happens it happens very organically, where you take a card early because it's strong, because it like increases your raw output relative to your starter deck. And we haven't really covered it, but your starter deck is
really sucks. There's like 5 basic attack cards, 5 basic defense cards, and 2 like bonuses, but they're all kind of bad.
Yeah. And that's kind of like by design, is that in the beginning you're taking kind of like any attack common that you can get your hands on, just because you need damage to get through the fights. And then all of these commons have different mechanical hooks to them, and then as the run evolves, you are incentivized differently to take different cards or take different relics. And part of the fun of the game is that there's no like blanket rules about which cards are best, which strategies you need to go for. Everything is extremely contextual. And so getting good at Slay the Spire is about improving your decision making and your card evaluation based on the context in a way that I feel like is very unique to this game.
It's what makes this game so compelling, and like I just can't put it down sometimes. And it's because of that context and that synergy. But I do think the idea of synergy does translate to Magic, where we have these, like, I think ideally we have these weak game pieces that can be recontextualized into a stronger whole. And that's what synergy is at its most basic. But I think that's a useful tool for cube designers, is to like understand how synergy works.
I would challenge that a little bit. I mean, I agree
Sure.
with most of what you said. It's the weak part that you said. So I guess in Magic, like the typical drafting process is that you take the strongest cards at the start. And that's kind of similar in Spire, is that you take the cards that are strongest for the setting. You need a lot of just attacks to get through Act 1. But you take them because they are strong relative to your starter deck. And it's those hooks that like kind of the incidental synergy hooks that it has that
Right.
Allow you to build upon it from there. So I think in both Spire and Magic, it doesn't require that it's weak. It's almost I think it's almost worse if it's weak cards that you're relying on there, because that tends to lead to things being very poisonous in a way. And I think one of the traps that new Spire players have is that they want to think about decks as very like rigid, predefined archetypes. And if you go to like a Spire wiki, you'll see like that it's listed that the defect has like 12 different deck archetypes that it can. I don't think that's really a very productive way to think about it. I think it's just about like learning to realize like the contextual, like the synergistic power of cards given what you have.
I agree. I use the term weak to describe how synergy could be the thing that makes you pick a card like Volt Charge, which is 3 mana, 3 damage and proliferate, over a card like Lightning Strike, which is just 2 mana for 3 damage. So like these relatively weak cards become greater than the sum of their parts in the context of synergy.
All right. Well, I want to pick up on this Volt Charge thing you said.
Okay.
I think there's something very interesting there. So I mentioned earlier how there's like a very small card pool that each character in Spire is working with, and I went on that like way too long rant about all the not even all of them, a lot of the synergies that Reckless Charge had. The Spire card, not the Magic card. And I think when it comes to cube design, I mean, so historically there's been like this singleton context, and I feel like the more that I do like real design work, like I've been working on this, this actual game that's on Steam out there, that it's if you're trying to design something, it's much more important to have the right card that has lots of synergistic hooks than have a bunch of different unique cards. And if you look at any given Magic set, they, the total number of commons and uncommons is like, I don't know, 100 cards or something. And those cards are, you have like one rare pack. So those cards are like more than 90% of the card pool. And they're chosen to do a lot of legwork. And I think without synergy, people don't really, I don't think Magic continues as a popular game. Like if you get those like learn to play Magic 30 card decks, like they're very simple, they're very easy for anyone to play, but even those like have lots of little examples of like 1 + 1 = 2.5, like little synergistic edges you can get by combining cards. And I think that is what draws people into the game, is like the joy of feeling clever in that way, that it's not just like the raw card that wins for you, but it's you who combines them in a certain way to get that advantage.
Yeah, it's that feeling of discovery, because you get hooked because you learn to recognize the rate of cards and pick the ones with the higher rate, but then that unlocks this world of synergy, and it leads to player discovery as they start to combine these cards in novel ways that do make 1 + 1 = 3 or whatever.
Yeah, I will say when I started playing Spire, and I would post my screenshots of my winning runs to the Riptide forums, is that it gave me the feeling that like I was inventing strategies almost. And as I've played more, I've realized that's like totally not the case. Like, all these tools are there very purposefully. The game itself is basically like a synergy playground, and you put together these decks that like make you feel like a genius, that you like found this combination of interactions to like do something really fun and clever. And I feel like at times Singleton hampers your ability to do this.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I totally agree that the genius of Spire is that you just feel like you're the one who shows up at the Pro Tour with the sleeper deck that nobody else found when you stumble on a synergy in that game. And it feels so good. And so I'm not quite sure, and I'm hoping you can elaborate on how the singleton restriction that many cube designers adhere to is hampering that same feeling in a Magic cube.
Let's take Bolt Charge, for example.
Okay.
Is that, they could put any burn charge they want to in, or is that Mirrored and Besieged or something? They chose to put a burn card in there that was like highly synergistic with what was going on. That there's lots of charge counters on things. You can even proliferate poison counters or -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures. And when I mentioned reckless charge, it's that there could be in like Spire like 50 more attacks and all these different things. This one card has so much synergy potential that I think including more just different cards for the sake of diversity dilutes the amount of synergy in your card pool. And I don't know, to give an example from my cube, it used to be that I had all sorts of different like 1-mana cantrips in my cube, and I really had so much fun like playing with Courser Crucifix and doing these things that care about the top of your library. And to me, that's like one of the most fun interactions in Magic. And I said, okay, we're having a ton of brainstorms in my cube. And all of a sudden, these top of the library things could actually function. And I have fun every time I get one of those decks put together. It's not like the only way to play blue-green. It's not, or blue-green-black or any of these things, but the fact that it is there increases like the strategic diversity within my cube. It's getting more synergy connections out of the number of card slots that I had. And I think if I would revert that it makes my cube less fun to play.
I can see that for sure. And I recall another non-singleton change you made in your list was for multiple grave crawlers, right?
A big problem I had when I started playing cube is that I never had fun playing aggro in people's cubes. Is that like,
yeah,
I don't know, like people would be like, oh, here's this like green-white beatdown deck that works in this cube, and I would play it and just be miserable the whole time, whether I was winning or losing, because there was so little like agency as a player. Like it was efficiently statted dudes that turned sideways, and I won or lost the game based on like the order of my draw pile. And whether it was good or not relative to the cube was kind of irrelevant to me. And so what I really tried to do was make the aggro decks more fun to play. So like green white for me became a bit of a landfall playground, and black aggro relied a lot on very powered up aristocrat stuff off of multiple carrion feeders and grave crawlers. And over time, I did dial that back a lot. My current list has 1 grave crawler, and I'm still playing with 2 carrion feeder because I think sack outlets are still hard to come by at a reasonable power level. But as far as like recursive toys, like they've printed so many that you no longer need a grave crawler in multiples to like get that feeling of having like a synergistic deck.
Because you were doing that back in like the prehistoric days of...
Yeah, this was like 2013.
Was there even electricity? I mean,
we played by candlelight most nights.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
And I'm not going to claim that like quad gravecrawler was like brilliant design by any means. I will say that for many years it was a ton of fun, and I think it like gave the drafters who played my cube something to look forward to. And I saw a ton of different like aristocrat builds because I really like baked that into like the DNA of my cube. And I don't know. I mean, you see that in Magic sets, they tend to be about big unifying themes at a certain level. That, you know, Strixhaven is about casting spells, Mirrodin is about artifacts, you have enchantment blocks and all these things. And part of that, I think, is for marketability, but I think part of that is because, like, on a mechanical level, it really, you know, Magic is about too many things in total. And if you want to have a good draft environment, you need to make like a cohesive set of mechanics that work together.
Yeah. So one of the things that I latched onto as you were describing your singleton breaks was this concept of like, I didn't have fun playing this deck. And contrasting that to the discussion we've had about Spire, it's like, I don't know that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you say fun, I'm hearing you say synergy and a feeling of discovery. And decks that are not as fun, which is what we might say colloquially. If we were to translate that into design, it could mean there's little opportunity for discovery, for novelty, for synergy. The things that make us come back and go for run after run after run of Spire might be the things that are missing in that deck that you just don't like to play.
I think I don't know. I've played other Spire-likes where it's like the synergy is not as present, where they have, say, certain mechanics that are very, I would call them siloed, or I guess poisonous or parasitic is also a word you could use, but it's like, this character has 5 cards that work with a mechanic, but it's really only these 5 cards. So it's like you commit to a very like rigid deck form, a rigid mechanical form. And with Spire, I feel like it's this big web of interconnective mechanical tissue. And a lot of that, we haven't really talked about relics much because we've been talking more about cards, but I think relics do a lot in contextualizing how you build a deck. Like, to take a simple relic, Shuriken says if you play 3 attacks in a turn, you gain a strength for the rest of the fight. Which does encourage more of like these 0-cost attacks that I mentioned. And you can really you'll have by the end of the run like 20 something relics, and you can build into some of those. But what Spire has done, every card you have changes how you evaluate things. Every relic you have changes things. It is a digital card game, but I feel like they've shown a lot of restraint, and that the main thing they use the digitalness of it for is in streamlining computations. Like, if you imagine like this being a board game, it would be miserable with like the amount of like arithmetic and tracking all the different relics, and you have cards that grow in effectiveness over the course of a fight or a run. Like, there's so much kind of like paperwork you would have to do to get through it. And I think I don't know quite where I'm going, but I find it kind of like, I've thought about trying to make like a Spire type of like card game, like a physical card game before, and it's hard to get past that hurdle exactly of like, how do you have all these like relics or powers or things that give you some incremental benefit without bogging the whole game down in tracking those incremental benefits.
That's another thing that is like baked into the starting resources of the game. Like, because you start with 80 health, and many of your, or thereabouts 80 or so, and your enemies often have like 100 or 200 health. That makes like in almost the entire number line from 0 to 100 relevant quantities to put on a card. And contrast that to Magic, where you can really only do like 1 to 3 damage on a burn spell and keep it in a reasonable range.
Unless you restrict it to only targeting creatures and you don't have Stuffy Doll in your environment.
So I guess what I'm saying is like the knob on Slay the Spire turns way past what Magic turns to. And so they're like, there's a lot more gray area in the middle, which makes it impossible to track in paper, which explains one of the reasons why Magic has chosen a life total of 20 and a mana system of incrementing 1 a turn and so on. Just because it's the only thing that you can track in paper feasibly.
Oh man, I had such a good like jump off thought that I lost once I said yeah. I remember one time I was like, we were on a ski trip, and I was like, at the end of the day, everyone's like chilling in the hotel room, and I was with my wife's family, and I was playing some Spire, and I had my like 60 health character against Donu Deka, which are like 250 health characters. And I remember my brother-in-law saying, this is not a fair fight, like just looking at the life totals. And
Yeah.
I guess that's like something that happens in Magic too, where people try to judge the score by the life total without appreciating what else is going on.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me how like the way the resources are allocated and given to players and the numbers on the cards kind of organically give rise to all of these synergistic hooks. It gives rise to the quantities and the qualities which make cards powerful, and gives rise to that web of synergy that we love about games in general, Magic, Spire, any games. I think it's what keeps us returning to a game time and again. And it's all just like out of these mechanics, which is so weird to me and so like delightful.
It's kind of like weird to me, but also fitting that you keep mentioning like the numbers. But I think at its core, like Spire is a game that makes math fun.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair to? Were you like a math kid growing up?
Yeah. Yep. I think that's fair.
I sense some like hesitation in you.
Well, I was like, you can't really describe yourself as an autodidact because it makes you sound arrogant. But I was, as a kid, I would just like learn anything I could, whether it was math or English or whatever. So I was a math kid, but I was also like an everything kid, I guess.
Yeah, I was definitely a math kid. I know that when I was like, I think 3 years old, lots of kids had different toys. My main toy was like a jar of coins, and I knew how much each coin was worth. And whenever we had like a down moment, I would dump out the coins and then count up how much they were worth, which I don't think is a normal like 3-year-old behavior.
Maybe not. Yeah.
But it's certainly been like baked into my personality for a long time to love numbers in a certain way. And I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you kept mentioning the numbers on the cards, and yeah, I think there's something there. I wonder, because you said your partner also plays Spire. Is she into math, or?
She is into math by way of music theory. So yes and no. But then again, she's also like, she beat the game before I did. She beat the heart before I did in less time. Like it took me longer, more runs to beat the heart. So, maybe I should be playing more music.
Yeah, I think the you're talking earlier about like how things unfold in a Spire run. I think the interesting tightrope you have to walk is that like you start off with this bad deck, and pretty much any card you add to it at the beginning will make the deck better, and it's attacks that you need at the beginning to beat the elites. But if you overload on these kind of early game cards, you have a deck that's too like watered down to function well by the end game.
Right.
And so it's really about like, weaving through this, like getting strong without getting too early game strong, and doing as much as you can without dying. And I feel like there's the game is split up into like 4 acts, basically 3 acts. There's a bonus one at the end, but there's always this like interesting point where at the start of Act 2, you normally feel awful. Like your deck is very like underprepared for the enemies that you're facing, which are much tougher than the Act 1 enemies. And you're usually like building towards something, but you're not really quite there yet. And often you'll have in runs like this kind of turning point where your deck has specific needs that you feel as you're playing the fights. And if you address them, like it's off to the races and you start like really getting strong. And there's other runs where you just die there. But like there's an interesting, like the threat of death is always there. And like the pursuit of getting strong amongst this, I feel, is very rewarding.
Mm-hmm. As far as how Spire has this like spinal tap to my reward center in my brain, part of it is discovering those synergies. Part of it is simply that like visceral pleasure of like looting things and earning power-ups and like leveling up. And I just love that feeling. And I just can't stop chasing it.
Now, this is something that I talked a bit with Andy and Anthony when I was on last time about. I feel like Spire, they've patched it over time. It's become more and more stable. It's really been a long time since they made two major changes to the game, and people continue to play it, continue to love it, because I feel like, as far as things that we have available to us, I think it's like as close to a perfectly designed card game as I can think of. Mm-hmm. And, it's okay being in this stable place. I have some gripes with the game. I'm sure that if the developers ever make a Spire 2, that it'll have learned from some of the things that I think Spire 1 didn't quite do as well. But it's more or less like a finished product now. Whereas Magic and to a lesser extent Cubes are kind of on this constant carousel of new content. And I asked Andy and Anthony if we should be kind of like pursuing perfection in a way, like that we finish our cube designs, or I sometimes feel like this like need for newness is like taking away from the pursuit of perfection.
To the extent that you can optimize your cube without updating it with new cards, if you can optimize it in that space, in that kind of local space, and your cube gets meaningfully closer to your design goals, you might not be updating it in the way that we cube designers typically say. We usually say update to mean I dropped $100 on Modern Horizons 2 and have changed everything about the list. So you can still be updating it, but making these smaller local like optimization changes that are still creating an environment that's better for your goals. It's just not large scale. It's not a new set in the way that Neon Kamigawa is going to be a new set compared to VOW, compared to Midnight Hunt. It's a new set because it's closer to your design goal, even though the card pool maybe hasn't changed much or doesn't use new cards.
What are you working on these days?
Well, I'm continuing to kind of think about. I've really enjoyed a high fixing density, high multicolor spell, very low curve environment, and so I'm trying to optimize in that space. Breaking singleton on cards like Faithless Looting, like fetch lands, like Curd Ape, to try and cultivate those like very fast, decision dense games that I personally enjoy. So that's what I'm doing when I'm not kind of scrubbing out on Slay the Spire runs.
I do feel like the high fixing density has kind of like been catching on, can I say?
Yeah, if by catching on you mean now Andy is slowly adding more fixing lands to the Bun Magic Cube, which is really my only metric for success, then yeah, I think it's catching on.
There's always like that voice in my head of like, what are the community's like expectations and definitions of a cube that I feel like is kind of like detrimental in a way, and something that we shouldn't necessarily like let speak to us so much. And when I've been doing design work for like other games, like non-cube stuff, for I've been doing some feedback and testing for Roguebook, which is something in the Spire genre, is that I find it much like more liberating to be able to just like fully pursue what I think is good design without these other kind of cultural constraints in my mind.
Yeah.
I just feel like this concept that every draft needs to be 360 unique cards kind of comes from, I don't know where it comes from. I don't see that sort of stuff in game design at large, and in the work that I've been doing, there was a card that we came up with for some upcoming DLC that really kind of like struck the right note in terms of like what we needed the card to be doing, and so it's put at common because it's a fun card, and you will see it a lot in the game. It's powerful, but fun and interesting to play with. And I don't think that if a Spire character or something had like 400 cards, that it would be a better design.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be such a one note pony, but I feel like I don't know, when you get outside of like cube circles and you do some like work or looking into like actual design projects, that it's a bit I don't know. I don't know how things became so like insular and tribal, and like why people care so much about upholding some arbitrary design structures from a long time ago. And I don't really see how it's productive. I guess it's profitable for Wizards that they have these cubes that they can march out and have people play, but I don't see the benefit of like if the most fun thing you can design happens to be singleton, then that's fine, but I don't see the benefit of like an a priori definition in that way.
There's like two competing directives, which is like in the Slay the Spire like spike mentality, the more consistent your deck is, I feel the stronger it is. And so like a deck of 5 cards or whatever, if it's doing something powerful consistently, then you see your entire deck every turn and you're able to do that powerful thing every turn, which is great. Applied that to cube design, and it's like, wait, the fewer unique designs I have in the cube, the more consistent the synergies I want will be. Which is an argument for less singleton, for more duplicate effects. But then at the same time, Discord member and Riptide Lab member Feld had this quote a couple weeks ago that has stuck with me, where if you break singleton on a card and include duplicates, it increases the chances that that card gets taken for granted. So like Tarmogoyf is a historically important, like exciting, powerful card, right? And there are no green 2-drops that are in the same league in terms of power and toughness per mana.
Right.
So like you could say, I'll break singleton on this, play 5 Tarmogoyfs. They all interact with the graveyard. It'll make graveyard decks kind of coalesce around that Delirium adjacent strategy, and maybe that's your goal. But
I don't
it'll
even hate
also
that,
make,
to be honest.
I personally love the gameplay. I play as many Delirium cards as I can find.
Well, it also makes like Graveyard Hate more interesting, and like you create a mechanical identity there, and I don't know, maybe sometime you're in like green-red faithless looting stuff that powers up your Goyfs, or you have some like instant speed things that mill yourself that can like serve as combat tricks to make Goyf stronger.
Scour or whatever.
Yeah, like there's a lot that can be there. I won't say off the top of my head that that's a bad idea.
No, but I guess the risk is that Tarmogoyf ceases to feel special for your drafters. Maybe, I mean, my usual play group isn't the kind of player who has played with Tarmogoyf extensively or even has ever, owned a Tarmogoyf. And so like it's special to open that, to play it, to build your deck around it. And if there's 5 of them, I don't know that same emotional experience is captured.
Yeah, I mean,
so there's a trade-off,
hard,
right?
Because like as much as I want to treat, like when I'm trying to think about things, often I try to treat Cube as like entirely detached from the game of Magic, but that's not how anyone actually interfaces it when they play it. And certainly, like for me, I enjoy at some level playing with cards that were important cards when I was most active in Magic, like when I was playing Standard and that sort of thing. So
yeah,
I'm very attached to like Zendikar cards.
And like by the same token, my very first deck was this like Naya Zoo deck. I think it was loosely based off the Ajani Vengeant dual deck. And so who's my favorite Planeswalker? It's Ajani Vengeant. And my favorite 1-drop is Wild Cattle. And it's just always going to be that way. So yeah, we can't really escape the emotional experience of Magic.
I like step links more than the red step links.
Yeah.
That's not logical.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking with me. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I look forward to you leveling up in Spire.
Me too. I feel like I've really learned some things. I think that might be a great like conclusion to this conversation. Like if there are 3 takeaways from this episode, they should be that your emotions as you come back to a game that you enjoy should signal something about the strength of that design. The second would be that the numbers and the resources in a game help determine what cards are or are not powerful. And then the third, which you've articulated eloquently, is that the expectations of the Cube community or the historical expectations surrounding Cube might not be ideal for every individual Cube designer now. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. Slay the Spire is made by Mega Crit Games. And the talking is done by me and my friend Jason Waddell. Well said.
You can cut that out if you like listen back and you decide that this is like, one rant too many from me. Sometimes if you get these kind of complex infinite decks where it's like a lot of clicking to make it go infinite, like it's very fun the first time, and then after that it's like office work. So
yeah.
There have been runs where I just QED'd them and I was like, I have demonstrated an infinite, I'm going to drop this run because I don't feel like doing all this clicking anymore.